Hi, I'm Debbie Cowley. I'm one of the account managers at Media First. Thank you for joining us today for part 2 of our webinar, Building Relationships with Journalists in a Changing Media Landscape. We are joined by Chris Maughan and Chris Maughan again. Hello, both of you. Thanks for joining us. We had great feedback from the first webinar and loads of questions from everybody watching. We didn't have time to answer them all during the webinar, which is why we're here today. I'm going to pose your questions to Chris and Sean. For anyone who's not met these two lovely chaps in front of me, Sean is currently Director of Media and Corporate Communications at Save the Children, but previously he was a foreign editor at Sunday Times. He was also a reporter at the Daily Mail and has had lots of other high-profile roles in the media. Chris is one of our Media First journalist tutors. You might have met him on one of our training courses. He was a familiar face on ITV News for many, many years. For anyone who's not met me before, I am one of the account managers at Media First. So my job is to talk to our lovely clients, to understand their media and communications training needs, and to turn that into actual courses to help them and their spokespeople out. So without further ado, let's get on with the questions. Question number 1. I'm going to start with quite a nice straightforward one, but I know we hear this a lot. So Matt Barker has asked, to call or not to call? If you've got a good contact, do you risk annoying them, as in a journalist contact, by calling if they've ignored your emails? Chris, do you want to answer that one?
Well, I think more importantly, the question would be, does he have a good story to offer? And that's the key. If he's got a good story to offer, then the journalist should be pleased to hear from him. It is fair to say that in this era when some PR organisations end up sending catch-all emails to whole groups of journalists on the one newspaper or one media broadcast outlet, perhaps I should say, that can irritate individual journalists, and they'll be thinking, well, this really isn't for me, and it may not get read and it could be ignored. If he feels that it's not being sort of read and dealt with, then he can call in. He does risk annoying the odd individual journalist, but perhaps he could. It may even be a courtesy call to say that, did you see my email? We've got a PR day coming up, or we've got an event coming up, and just want to see whether you want to be added to the list. So perhaps even using that courtesy angle to get onto the list could work for him if he needs to make that follow-up phone call.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. The next question is from Sam Dowling, and this is very much about the changing media landscape. Sam asks, I can't remember the last time I bought a newspaper. Is the power of the columnist diminished? Chris, do you want to go in with that one again?
You're starting with me, are you? Well, I still do tend to buy newspapers. I love newspapers, but I do appreciate that I'm in sort of a falling group in that sense. And I was just spotted, there was a piece in the Press Gazette, the media magazine, I think it was some time ago, that newspaper circulations have certainly dropped dramatically with more people consuming their media online. And I think the numbers were that in the year 2000, the combined readership of 16 daily and Sunday papers came to more than 21 million. And 20 years later, that figure has fallen to more than to 7.5 million or so. So is the power of the columnist diminished? Well, they're probably not reaching as many readers, but they're still there for a purpose, whether it's to entertain or perhaps to offer a particular political angle, I don't know. So they still have their role to play, but they're not reaching as many readers. That would be my perspective on it. I'm sure Sean will have a view as a former foreign editor at the Sunday Times and his positions at the Mail.
Well, I take a different view because I don't buy many newspapers these days. I used to buy every paper every day, but now I read 4 or 5 newspapers on my phone in the morning before I open my laptop and start my real working day. And I think it's true to say that some newspapers now have tens of millions of readers where they only had millions in the past, because they have a global reach through apps and websites. And the columnists on papers like the Mail, through Mail Online, are read by far more people than has ever been the case in the past. So they retain a very strong influence. On the columnists who write for papers that are behind a paywall, they're obviously being read by fewer people, but they still have their strong influence. So if you're, I don't know, Gideon Rachman, the Chief Foreign Affairs commentator at the Financial Times, you're still going to be invited in to see ministers, you're still going to be invited to all the receptions and the breakfasts and be courted by the spooks and the military because you know an awful lot, and his columns are extremely influential and read by very large proportion of people at the Foreign Office. So the columnists who are really good and carry clout haven't lost the weight that they've always had.
But isn't that also a key thing that you just mentioned there, Sean, that as to whether they end up being behind the paywall? Because as you say, Mail Online, the numbers have grown considerably, but other outlets are behind paywalls and perhaps their audiences will have fallen.
You're right, Chris. Of course, the columnists for papers behind paywalls are read by fewer people, but they're still read by influential people, and they're still read by the people that they're trying to influence. So if you're a business columnist, you're probably going to be read by all the top people in the city if you work for the Times or the FT, because although they're behind paywalls, the companies that those executives work for will have subscriptions for the company or for themselves. So they still have a lot of influence, even if they don't have quite as many readers. And most papers are still not behind a paywall. You know, the Sun tried a paywall and it didn't work, so now it's abandoned it, and it's almost caught up with the Daily Mail in terms of the number of readers it has. So Sun columnists, Mirror columnists, Guardian columnists, of course, that's also free to view online, and the Mail still have a huge reach, not only in the UK, but around the world.
It's interesting you moved on to talk about paywalls, because we had a question specifically about that from Jimmy Smallwood. And Jimmy said that some of his spokespeople feel there's little point giving an interview to a website where most people won't even read it. Obviously, you made some case against that just then, Sean, but are there any other points you can make to help his spokespeople get around that issue?
I think it depends on who you're trying to reach. So my charity tries to reach people on the centre-right because we try to win an argument with the centre-right about the value of aid. So we place a very high value on getting into the Daily Telegraph or the Times, because through them we can reach readers who are maybe marginally engaged with the issue, or they might be opposed to us but not particularly opposed to us, and so we feel that we can help to win the debate through those newspapers. So we know that they don't have a massive readership if they're behind a paywall, but we also know that the people who do read those papers are the ones that we're trying to reach. So my answer to the questioner would be, it depends. It just depends on who you're trying to go for. If you want a mass audience, you'll be targeting somebody like the Mail. If you want a centre-right audience, I still think it's worth going to the Times and the Telegraph. And if you're of the left, then that's fine, because you've always got the Guardian. People read The Guardian all over the world, and it has around about 10 million readers a day the last time I looked.
Wow. Excellent, thank you. Another question on the changing media landscape. This is from Amanda. How much is podcasting replacing traditional channels? Chris, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. Well, whether it's replacing or, let's say, complementing, because certainly podcasting is growing. The numbers are rising, and considerably. And so podcasting is an increasingly important sort of media outlet. And importantly, for those who are using it as a platform, are the demographics, because so many of the listeners to podcasts are aged between sort of 26, 35. So a much younger audience than perhaps many of the newspapers currently enjoy. So yes, as an outlet, it's growing, and also the demographic is quite interesting because of the younger audience that podcasts reach.
Excellent, thank you. We're going to move on to talk a little bit about COVID. This is from Caroline. Has COVID changed what audiences crave for the better? Do journalists now seek more positive human interest stories?
Yes, COVID has been relentlessly grim for a very long time, and editors know that during this pandemic, as during wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that went on for a really long time, readers get bored with the same thing over and over again, and they stop reading it. It's depressing. They're not learning anything particularly dramatically new most days, so they turn the page or switch to another channel. So what editors like in these situations are stories to contrast with COVID. All editors are looking for a news list full of a variety of stories. So there'll need to be stories with a bit of glamour, need to be stories with some personalities, and there'll need to be positive stories to contrast with all this negative news around the pandemic. So I think this is a great time for pitching positive stories. The one thing COVID has done really is focus a lot of interest on science and technology. And of course, science has produced the answer to COVID in many ways through the vaccines. And I think this has generally increased the appetite of editors for an area that might have seemed a bit nerdy and geeky and specialist a couple of years ago, but is now seen as being of much broader interest because we've all been affected. We've all been touched by the science that's been developed in the last year.
Well, that's interesting because I'm just going to whiz down here, and we did have a question particularly relating to people in that field. So yeah, this is from Judy. Judy says there's a big issue with trust between, well, it's actually academics and journalists. I was wrong on the link. Any tips on reassuring academics on their trust issue with journalists?
Well, this is really hard. I used to be a science correspondent at the Sunday Times, so I can tell you that a lot of academics would be unhappy with the things that I wrote because I would have to take a very sophisticated, complex story of their research and turn it into something that everyone could understand. And that inevitably involved simplifying it. And I would always say it wasn't dumbing down, it was just extracting the most important bits. But to a scientist, often it does feel as if it's been dumbed down. And because a lot of journalists are not that scientifically literate, they do make mistakes. I mean, I used to check some of my stories with academics to make sure that I wasn't going to really embarrass myself in the paper. And it was amazing how many mistakes that I made if I ran a few paragraphs past a professor at Cambridge or something. So I think one of the other problems for academics is that journalists get so much wrong. And that means that, of course, there is a difficulty with trust. There are some brilliant science writers around. So Clive Cookson at the FT, the science editor of the FT, is my favourite science journalist. He's absolutely brilliant. And I think he's probably got a very high degree of trust because he writes really authoritatively about some of the more innovative science that's going on. For example, the microbiome, the microbiota, the microorganisms in your gut, and all the implications that they have for general health. It's a fascinating area, and Clive Cookson at the FT has led some of the reporting on that. So I would be very surprised if too many scientists were disappointed with his work. It's bringing their work to attention.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so next question from Emma Hill. Is there a difference between how you respond to how you guys respond to PR's pitching versus journalists that are newer to the profession? It feels like there's a bit of a divide between old school hacks and those journalists that are after the clickbait trending pieces. Chris, do you want to let us know your thoughts on that?
So are you putting me in the category of
I'm
the
saying your
older
experience,
hack, the old school hack, Debbie? But fair enough. I don't know. I still think, obviously, you know, those running the news desks and editing outlets across the media spectrum, they're still looking for the best stories for their audience. It ends up coming down to the audience, doesn't it, in all cases, and whether or not those stories and that content will resonate with the audience. And that's really, for any PR organisations, PR specialists, that's what they've got to think about. Who are they targeting? Who are they trying to reach? And it may well be, you reference all the clickbait trending pieces, it may well be that their target is via social media or certain platforms like that. And I think then it's just a case of sort of working out where you're going with your story, your content, who you're trying to reach. Will it work with the audience? That has to be the key.
Thank you. Okay. Emma Tucker says, do you think there's a bigger appetite now for regional spokespeople in national stories to move away from the London-centric national reporting? And she also says, what's the best way to establish spokespeople as the go-to experts? Sean, to you for that one, please.
The answer is yes, there is more demand for regional spokespeople, and part of the reason for that is there's a general sense that we've been London-centric for far too long. That goes for the government, which has opened a Department of the Treasury in, I believe, Darlington, and it goes for Channel 4, which has moved out of London, and it goes for the BBC, which has moved its breakfast TV and Radio 5 Live to Salford. So everybody is trying to make it themselves more give themselves more national appeal. And that's as it should be, because if your audience is people within the M25, you're missing out on a whole chunk of audience, and in commercial operations, a whole chunk of revenue. So the more accents you can get out there, the more regional perspectives you can get out there, the more balanced a news list would be. And I dread to think what the editor of the Today programme on Radio 4, for example, would say if her reporters presented her with a bunch of stories that were all London and all people with southern accents. It just wouldn't work anymore.
And on the second part of that question, Debbie, about spokespeople establishing themselves as go-to experts, I mean, once again, the key is that when they do get the opportunity to perform, make sure they come across as engaging, charismatic, charming, put on a good show, a good performance, and the chances are they'll be invited back.
Excellent, thank you. Moving on now, Sean, we're going to cover some questions that particularly relate to, you were very open in the webinar about the two crisis that you've faced since you joined Save the Children. I recommend anyone that's not seen the webinar can click and find out all the details of that. But there's a few questions that directly relate to that, so I'm going to come to you if that's okay. The first one is from Richard, and Richard asks, you did tell us about the kind of key learnings from both of the crises that you faced, but I wonder if you could just kind of summarise for us now, maybe the top learnings, if you like, from everything that you dealt with there.
Yes, I think the main thing is to be in control of the narrative as far as you can, and that means establishing yourself early on as the primary source of information. If you don't do that, you create a vacuum that journalists will fill by going to other sources. They might be sources who speculate, or they might be sources who don't like your organisation and say bad things about it. And the coverage is just not going to be as good in a really difficult situation. So that's the first thing, to try and take control as much as you can. The second thing, which is related, is you have to be really quick. So it's no good if a story breaks at 6 in the morning, as happened when ISIS attacked Save the Children office in Afghanistan. It's no good waiting until everyone's in the office at 9 to decide what to do. You just need to get on the phone to people, sort out a line, get a statement out there, so that you've established yourself early on as a source of good information, reliable information, and so that journalists then follow up hearing you on the radio, whatever it might be, by calling you. And that, again, puts you a little bit more in control. And the third thing I say is that the mistake we probably made at Save the Children was that we were too defensive, and we went into a bunker, and we didn't really engage with journalists asking critical questions except through formal emails and brief statements. It didn't really work at all. So my advice to anyone in a similar situation, and the thing I will do in future if I'm faced with that situation again, is really to engage with your critics. Really have a proper chat to a journalist who's got a series of critical questions or a leak about your organisation, because that way you can establish a rapport which establishes a little bit of trust, and it may be that you're able to give them a more rounded view of a story, even if it's a very negative story in the end.
Caroline Clancy, hello Caroline. Caroline agrees with you, Sean. You said in the webinar that staff at charities are really passionate about the cause. She says she imagines that it would have been really tough for you, your comms team, during the crisis. And the question is, how did you look after their well-being during that time?
It's a really good question, because, of course, people who work for charities don't expect to be attacked by the Daily Mail and the BBC and the Times and lots of other people in the course of an average working day. So it's a bit of a shock for them to find themselves at the centre of so much hostile attention. It's also exhausting when you're on the receiving end of just a barrage of calls, so that every time you put the phone down, it rings, and you wonder how you'll get through all the queries in the day. So people are working very hard under pressure that they're not really used to in many cases. So it was very important for us to bond as a team. So we would have, during our breaks, really open conversations about how we were feeling and about how to deal with certain questions where we could help each other because we dealt with similar things in the past, and we wanted to make sure that we were being consistent, of course, as well. And then a bit of humour always really helps. So a very simple thing that I had to sit up all night one night with a lawyer working out what we were going to say about some terrible story that was going to break the next day. So I was sitting in my shirt from the previous day, and I just said there's one guy on my team who goes to the gym every morning, so I just asked him if I could borrow his deodorant. And it got a little bit of laugh. I know it's a feeble joke, but it got a little bit of a laugh, and it just relieved some of the tension for the day. Well, I think we probably came through it closer than we were at the outset.
I'm sure you did. Another question for you from the charity side of things, from Marianne. Do you have advice for smaller charities who wish to build a reputation as sector experts amongst journalists?
Even the smallest charity has real expertise in something, and they just need to work out who would be interested to hear, to get some of the benefits of their wisdom. It could be the most obscure cause that you're in, but there will be a blogger out there who will be interested. There'll be a specialist media outlet who will be interested. So it's a question of working out who the audience is, what the best channel is for your message, and then getting it out there, ideally with something a bit newsy, something with a topical hook, something a bit unusual perhaps, and then following up on that with offers to write for that publication, offers to perhaps speak at a conference that roughly relates to your area of expertise. And you can gradually build up a profile as somebody with a bit of authority in that area, which is very much helped, of course, by social media. So we use LinkedIn a lot for our more thoughtful interventions in public debate. Anytime we've got something that we think is a bit pioneering for our sector, we whack that onto LinkedIn. And if it's got a bit of video sometimes as well, that really gives it a boost. It increases the engagement, it increases the amount of time people spend on your ideas. And I think we've been able to create a sense that we are thought leaders in some areas that won't be familiar to most of the people listening to this, but will be familiar to people in our sector. So that's what I would advise a small charity to do. Don't worry about the fact that they're small, just work out what it is that you've got to say that will be a contribution to the debate in the sector where you work, and go for it.
Excellent, thank you, Sean. We had a few questions about trust, which is interesting. You know, the webinar was about building relationships with journalists, and there's a theme of trust. You guys mentioned it in the webinar itself. You know, Sean, you said it's a two-way thing. It's not just about comms and PR teams trusting the journalists. So the questions we had in, one from Andrea. Chris, I'll send this to you first. Andrea asks, how can we make sure what we want to say is actually reported? Again, a trust issue, but any tips to ensure your message isn't diluted or misrepresented?
Yeah, I mean, interesting questions, and it is an issue that crops up, isn't it? That between journalists, you know, we're not always the most popular of individuals or as a sector. Let's put it that way. But what I would say, and once again, these are things that I've worked with Media First on the various training courses that we deliver, and that is for spokespeople, for organisations to be really clear and be precise about what they want to say, what they want to get across in that conversation. You know, leave the journalist, the interviewer, in no doubt as to what you're saying. Don't be vague, don't meander off into other areas if you can avoid it. And it's just that need for clarity, that this is what you are saying about any particular issue. And perhaps depending on the media outlet, the type of outlet you're dealing with, can you follow it up with an email and put it in writing, or send that person a text once again to add to it, to offer that clarity that there can be no doubt as to the point you are making in any particular situation. And in terms of the message being diluted or misrepresented, well, that once again, it's a similar thing, isn't it? That you've got to have that clarity as to what you're saying and be really clear. That's what I would say to journalists.
And there's just one small thing that I would add to that, if I may, Debbie, which is just sometimes people talk too fast for a journalist's shorthand. So a journalist has to pass 100 words a minute shorthand, but we speak at an average speed of 163, and I probably speak a little bit faster than that. So if I speak at my normal rate, I've got to be aware that a journalist is only going to be writing down half of what I say, and that leads to misunderstanding, and it leads to people being misquoted. So sometimes the simplest way to reduce the risk of errors in an article about something you're saying is just to say it more slowly. Brilliant
tip. Thank you, Sean. So the last kind of real question on trust is quite specific. I'm going to send this one your way, Sean. It's from Jimmy again, actually. He says he remembers working in PR and an exec refused to do an interview with the Mirror because in 2004, the paper faked British soldiers abusing Iraqi prisoners. What would you have said to try and persuade him to do the interview with the Mirror?
Well, that's quite a difficult one to be confronted with, because I think if you look at any newspaper, there's something shameful in its past. You just have to live with the fact that that's journalism. Journalists do get things wrong. Sometimes they get them spectacularly wrong. And in the case that you're talking about, I suspect it was when Chris Maughan was editing the Mirror. The Mirror is a very different paper now, edited by a woman who's one of the top journalists in the country, Alison Phillips. It's highly respectable. It does wonderful campaigning journalism in the style of the Mirror from the olden days, the pre-Piers Morgan days. So my advice would be just to try to explain a bit of that to the executive and perhaps show them the paper, show them a few articles from the paper recently which are relevant to your subject. Remind them that the Mirror has over 20 million readers every day online, on its app and on bits of paper. And say that there's a great chance to reach a big audience, and it's a paper. It's one of the papers that is actually least likely to distort what you want to say for a political reason.
Brilliant, thank you, Sean. A question from Ali here. Ali asks, how would you present a human interest case study story? Would a press release including key quotes and a link to a short case study work? Now, Ali's been in touch with us since she sent this question in and given us a bit more detail. And essentially, she read on a alternative journalistic blog that they wouldn't recommend using human case studies. Now, we spoke a bit about this in the webinar. So I'm going to throw to both of you. Chris, I'll start with you just to get your point of view on this, please.
Well, I guess it depends on the arena, the sphere in which the sort of human interest story is based. Because as journalists and getting involved in media, we do love human interest stories. Our stories all end up devolving back to people. There was a great story in the Times last week about an 84-year-old farmer, I think it was, in Derbyshire, who'd suddenly become a big hit on YouTube because of he's into meditation. And suddenly, even though he barely knew what the internet was all about, and he's now a star. So it was a fantastic human interest story. And we do love those human interest stories, but it might depend on the arena that you're talking about with this particular case study, with this particular story, as it were. And in terms of how you reach the media, from what you were suggesting, just remind me, Debbie, of the line that you were talking about, a press release and quotes. That would work for me. And also these days when certain aspects of the media, if it's the print media, can they offer photographs? Do they have any video that they can offer? Because these things can all work. And in that sense, from a media perspective, it may become an easy hit because, you know, journalists are under pressure to turn things around. Some organisations don't have the staffing numbers that they once had to carry out investigations and to put manpower into certain stories. So what they would regard as an easy hit can work in certain circumstances. So it depends on the arena that you're talking about with this particular human interest story.
I've just had one example. Save the Children is launching a campaign this week. It's going to say that 5 million children in 13 countries are on the brink of starvation. There's been a sort of creeping famine caused by COVID driving incomes down, but also interrupting food supplies, and that's pushed food prices up. So a lot of people are going hungry, and some of them very dangerously so. So if I just said 5 million people on the verge of starvation, I don't think anyone would be too interested in that. They might digest it as a headline on a very short story. But we've got some human content from Syria, and we've looked in particular at the data in Syria and worked out that's one of the places where hunger is increasing the most. And so we're telling the story of a family, of a mother who's desperately looking for the means to keep her children alive and get food for them. That's the thing that will really, I hope, bring the story alive for people. And we're going to carry on trying to do that between now and Christmas, just gathering video content from all the worst affected countries: Yemen, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan. And all the time we'll be telling human stories, because each human story is very distinct. And each human story seems relevant to us in some way, because we can all identify with a parent trying to look after a child. So it gives us a connection with the story if you include a human interest component. So I think Ali should definitely not be listening to the person from the alternative source. Should be listening to people like Chris and me.
Completely agree with you. Completely agree. Okay, nearly there. Just a few more questions. What is the best way to pitch your story to a journalist using WhatsApp or Telegram?
I actually don't have Telegram on my phone. I think you have to draw a line somewhere. I've got so many other ways of communicating that Telegram is one too many for me. If it's coming to me on WhatsApp, it's coming to me from somebody who's got my mobile number. I will undoubtedly look at it, because I look at everything that comes to me on WhatsApp. It's usually stuff from my family, but occasionally it's material from contacts. And so that's quite a good way to capture my attention, I must admit, although I would hate everyone listening to this to be tempted to contact me on WhatsApp with a story tomorrow, because it'll be going ping, ping all day, and that can be quite annoying.
We talked a bit about embargoes in the webinar, and we've got another question on that. What are the pros and cons of staggered embargoes, especially in Southeast Asia? Now, we have a training team internationally who would specialise in that market. But Sean, obviously, you told us a bit about your challenges as a former foreign editor at the Sunday Times in the webinar. What are your thoughts on embargoes, the staggered embargoes, and especially in different countries?
Well, we have the same challenge with Save the Children, because we have to work out how to launch stories in many, many different countries around the world. And I've come to the conclusion that it's not a workable solution to have a staggered embargo. It may work for some people. It doesn't really work for me, because if we have a good story and we launch it in Australia, it's going to go straight onto the international wires. It's going to go onto Reuters and Associated Press, and it will then be read in London. So there's no point in me trying to hold a story back until we get to London time. We've just got to work out a single embargo that will work best for the market where we want to have the most impact. So if it's in Asia, I don't mind what time it comes out in America. And if it's mainly an American story, I'll worry much less about what time it's going to be in Asia when that story is launched.
Excellent, thank you. A couple more then. Has your owned content and shorthand stories in particular helped advance your communications objectives? I think that's to you, Sean.
Yes, well, owned content is quite important to us. So we know that we are going to launch a report on education in September. So we'll be gathering video content and other content which we can use on our own channels, on our own Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook and YouTube. And that will all be part of the creating the impact of that story. We'll use social media particularly to spread the word and broaden the audience for that story. And sometimes we find that if we get really good engagement on social media, it gets picked up by legacy media, newspapers, the old-fashioned people, and often that's very much to our advantage. So own channels really key for us, and I think they would be for any large organisation.
Excellent. And the final question kind of moves on from that, really. It's asking, what tips would you give PR professionals on how to upskill on digital PR and on social media? Sean, do you want to continue with that one?
Yeah, I wanted everyone in my team to know how to make a film. So the person who knew the most about making a film took 15 of us into the kitchen, and he got us all to make a video of somebody making a cup of tea. Because when you do that, it may be the most boring viewing in the world, but it requires you to film from different angles, to notice what is least boring from the process, and then to edit something together in the end so that it just comes together as a coherent narrative. And we all learned that. And almost immediately after that, I went to Somalia, and I was in it was during a cholera epidemic, and I was in this sort of open hospital clinic that we were supporting, and it had open sides, and it was full of children with cholera. We managed to save 98% of the children with cholera, but I was able to use my newfound skills from filming tea making to make quite a touching little video about the cholera epidemic in Somalia, and I got it onto Huffington Post as a result. And I'm a bit of a technophobe, as some of the people at Media First will be able to tell you. So if I can do it, I think anybody can. It's best and cheapest, obviously, to teach each other these skills. And digital natives, the younger people, have these skills. They've just grown up with them. They can do anything. And if they teach some of the oldies what to do, then everybody is upskilled. Sometimes it's really useful to have somebody come in. So we noticed during the election before last that Momentum on the far left of the Labour Party was having an enormous impact, and it was being credited with getting the vote out for Corbyn in places where there wasn't expected to be much of a vote. So we wanted to know what had happened there and see if it applied to any of our campaigning work. And although we have no political affiliations at all, we're politically neutral, it was fascinating to hear the guy in charge of video at Momentum talking about the importance of authenticity in filmmaking, so that rather than having glossy filmmaking, as the Conservatives have done badly in that election. You remember Theresa May threw away the Tory majority. If you have something that looks as if it's been made on a film by an ordinary person featuring ordinary people, it's a much better watch. And then he taught us about the importance of having a bit of quirky content, because that makes it memorable, and then people talk about it and maybe share it. And a bit of humour is also good. So I think we took those three lessons: authenticity, quirky and humorous, from that one talk from an outsider. So sometimes that can be worthwhile. I think just look around you, see what's being done well in an area that you're interested in, and see if you can learn from an innovator outside your organisation as well as from each other inside.
Excellent. Thank you. Some great tips there, Sean. Chris, anything to add on that one?
Well, only I agree with Sean completely, and only the one point I would make is that obviously, even from what we might describe as the more traditional mainstream media, social media is so important these days that earlier in this conversation you referred to the old style hacks, Debbie, at one point, and even those guys are now being they are required then to put their headline or a few words, whether it's on Twitter or Instagram or on social media, as they're sort of getting back to the office or filing their stories. So they've also got to understand and use social media. So it is really important that there is that understanding of social media and digital technology in the office. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, that is all of the questions we've gotten through. Thank you for all of your insight during the webinar and today. And we hope that everybody watching finds it really interesting. Thank you.